humanity operates under a profound, deeply comforting, and utterly fatal illusion. We view the Earth as a silent, predictable, and completely passive stage, a static background designed exclusively for our endless theatrical performances of civilization. We sail our heavy ships of iron and oak across the vast oceans, believing we have mastered the currents. We construct our elegant stone cities along the fragile coastlines, convincing ourselves that we have permanently anchored our existence to the soil. We look out at the ancient towering mountains and the deep oceanic trenches, and we see nothing more than beautiful scenery. But the physical universe is not a painting, and the Earth is not a silent rock. It is a living, breathing, and incredibly violent ancient organism. Beneath the thin, fragile crust of soil and water that we call home, slumbers an incomprehensible, apocalyptic fury. And when this ancient beast finally decides to awaken, it does not merely erase our monuments with fire or wash away our arrogance with water. It completely annihilates our sanity with its very voice. It destroys us with a sound so absolute, so physically devastating, that it shatters the very fabric of the atmosphere. This is not just a story of a volcanic eruption. This is the chilling, catastrophic story of the day the Earth screamed. The year's 1883. The geopolitical map of the world is dominated by the sprawling, aggressive reach of European colonial empires. The location is the Dutch East Indies, a vast, exotic, and highly lucrative archipelago in modern-day Indonesia. Here, situated perfectly in the warm, turbulent tropical waters of the Sunda Strait, directly between the massive islands of Sumatra and Java, lay Krakatoa. To the naked eye of a passing sailor, Krakatoa was merely a small, lush, emerald green island rising peacefully out of the azure ocean. It was a beautiful, idyllic checkpoint for the heavy Dutch and British steamships carrying immensely valuable cargoes of spices, coffee, and rubber. The wealthy European merchants and aristocrats traveling on these luxurious colonial vessels would often stand on the polished wooden decks, admiring the exotic beauty of the island as they sailed past. They knew, scientifically, that Krakatoa was a volcano. In fact, since May of that year, the mountain had begun to actively vent. Minor tremors had shaken the nearby towns, and tall columns of white steam and gray smoke had been rising from the island's three main peaks. But in the supreme, blinding arrogance of the 19th century colonial mindset, these ominous geological warnings were completely misinterpreted. The sailors and the wealthy tourists did not view the smoke as an apocalyptic omen. They viewed it as a delightful natural fireworks display, a charming, exotic tourist attraction arranged specifically for their entertainment. Ships actively altered their navigational routes, sailing dangerously close to the island, just so the passengers could marvel at the ash clouds through their expensive brass binoculars. They sipped fine wine on the decks of their steamships, entirely insulated by the illusion that their modern technology made them untouchable. Their profound hubris had rendered them completely deaf and blind to the lethal reality of the Earth. They were enthusiastically clapping for a bomb that was ticking down to zero. The date is August 26, 1883, a Sunday afternoon. The atmospheric pressure shifted violently. The Earth had finally run out of patience. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the initial phase of the apocalypse began. With a deafening continuous roar, Krakatoa violently expelled a colossal pitch-black column of volcanic ash, pumice, and toxic gas straight into the stratosphere. The black pillar of destruction shot an astonishing 17 miles, 27 kilometers, high into the atmosphere, completely blocking out the sun. Within hours, the tropical afternoon was instantly, terrifyingly mutated into an absolute pitch-black, suffocating night. A radius of hundreds of miles was plunged into total blinding darkness. For the dozens of ships trapped in the Sunda Strait, the tourist attraction rapidly transformed into a claustrophobic nautical hell. Heavy, hot, gray volcanic ash began to aggressively rain down upon the wooden decks of the ships, falling exactly like a thick, gray, suffocating snow. The terrified sailors found themselves completely stranded in the middle of a boiling, pitch-black ocean, unable to see beyond the bows of their own vessels. But the horror of the ash was accompanied by a deeply unnerving, invisible predator. The friction of billions of volcanic particles churning in the massive ash cloud created a severe, highly unstable electrical anomaly in the atmosphere. The air became overwhelmingly saturated with intense, static electricity. The compasses inside the ship's binnacles began to spin wildly and erratically, completely failing to find magnetic north. The heavy brass barometers, designed to measure atmospheric pressure, fluctuated so violently that the mechanical needles snapped against the glass. But the most terrifying phenomenon occurred high above the sailors' heads. The heavy wooden masts and the intricate rigging of the trapped ships began to aggressively glow in the pitch-black darkness. Eerie, ghostly blue and purple electrical currents danced and sparked along the tips of the masts, hissing loudly in the toxic air. It was a terrifying manifestation of St. Elmo's fire, turning the stranded ships into glowing phantom vessels trapped in a black void. The sailors huddled in the dark, coughing on sulfur, praying to a god they could no longer see. But the nightmare of August 26th was merely a prelude, a quiet clearing of the throat before the final, ultimate roar. The true, absolute apocalypse arrived the next morning. August 27th, 1883. The time is exactly 2 minutes past 10 o'clock in the morning. Krakatoa did not simply erupt. The sheer volume of magma that had been expelled over the previous day had left the subterranean magma chamber entirely hollow. Unable to support its own immense weight, the massive volcanic mountain violently, catastrophically collapsed in on itself. Millions of tons of solid rock crashed down into the glowing superheated magma chamber below. Simultaneously, the violent structural collapse ripped open the seabed, allowing billions of gallons of freezing, dark ocean water to aggressively pour directly into the exposed 1,000-degree core of the Earth. Cold, heavy ocean water violently colliding with unconstrained, superheated magma. It is the ultimate apocalyptic chemical equation. The molecular bonds of the water were instantly, violently shattered. The water flashed into steam instantaneously, expanding its volume by over 1,000 times in a fraction of a millisecond. The resulting explosion defies all human comprehension. It unleashed an estimated 200 megatons of TNT, an explosive force more than 10,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In that exact fraction of a second, Krakatoa simply ceased to exist, vaporized entirely from the map. And from the epicenter of that vaporization, the loudest sound in the recorded history of planet Earth was born. This was not a noise. It was a physical, solid kinetic weapon of highly compressed air, moving like a concrete wall through the atmosphere. 40 miles away from the island, a British merchant ship named the Norham Castle was desperately fighting the ash storm. When the blast wave struck the ship, it did not merely rattle the wooden hull. The sheer kinetic force of the acoustic wave was so absolute that it instantly, violently ruptured the eardrums of more than half the crew on board. Grown hardened sailors collapsed to the wooden deck in agony, bleeding from their ears, permanently deafened by the voice of the earth. Nature had forcibly silenced its audience. The sound violently ripped across the ocean, defying all atmospheric logic. 3,000 miles away, 4,800 kilometers away, on the remote island of Rodriguez in the Indian Ocean, locals heard what they believed was the heavy, distant roar of naval artillery fire. To put the sheer, terrifying scale of this sound into perspective, it was the equivalent of a bomb detonating in New York City and the explosive roar being clearly heard by people standing on the streets of London. The devastating shockwave of compressed air traveled outward at the speed of sound. It was so immensely powerful that it literally circled the entire globe, not once, not twice, but 7.5 times. For 5 straight days, heavy brass barometers in weather stations from Paris to Washington, D.C. continued to record the violent, rhythmic pulse of the mountain's dying breath passing over them. The Earth had screamed, and the entire planet had physically vibrated from the impact. But the apocalyptic sound was only the beginning of the slaughter. The catastrophic collapse of the island had displaced an incomprehensible volume of the surrounding ocean. A colossal, dark, boiling tsunami was born before the wave struck. The ocean along the coasts of Java and Sumatra exhibited a terrifying, unnatural phenomenon. The water rapidly, silently withdrew, exposing miles of barren, muddy seabed. The sudden silence on the shores was the ultimate predator pulling back before the strike. Then a towering solid wall of pitch-black water, standing an astonishing 130 feet, 40 meters tall, surged aggressively outward from the epicenter. Moving at the speed of a modern passenger jet, this mountain of boiling water completely obliterated the coastlines. 165 coastal towns and thriving colonial villages were instantly, violently erased from existence. There was no warning. There was no escape. The massive black wave effortlessly ripped entire stone buildings from their foundations, uprooted ancient tropical forests, and carried heavy iron-hulled steamships miles inland, depositing them in the middle of jungles like broken toys. An estimated 36,000 human beings, men, women, and children, were violently swept away into the dark, churning abyss. They were simultaneously burned by the raining ash and drowned by the boiling sea. When the violent waters finally receded, the ocean surface had mutated into an unrecognizable, horrifying landscape. The sea was no longer water. It was choked entirely by massive floating islands of gray, porous pumice stone. These floating fields of volcanic rock were miles long and several feet thick, creating a massive, terrifying gridlock on the surface of the ocean. Rescue ships arriving days later found themselves completely stuck, their wooden hulls aggressively grinding against a solid ocean of gray stone. And trapped within those massive floating fields of pumice were the thousands of silent, tragic victims of the wave, washing endlessly against the shores. The wrath of Krakatoa, however, was not confined to the Indonesian archipelago. The mountain had injected an estimated 20 million tons of toxic sulfur dioxide and pulverized volcanic ash directly into the Earth's stratosphere. High above the weather patterns, rapid atmospheric winds aggressively carried this dark, toxic veil across the entire planet. Within months, the Earth was entirely wrapped in a thick, invisible sulfurous blanket. The global climate system was fundamentally disrupted. Global temperatures plummeted dramatically, causing erratic weather, failing crops, and freezing rains across the northern hemisphere. But the most profound, deeply unsettling effect of the eruption was visual. The millions of tons of microscopic volcanic particles suspended in the stratosphere began to aggressively filter and scatter the light of the sun. People standing on the streets of New York, Paris, and London looked up in absolute bewilderment to see the sun burning a sickly, eerie blue or a pale, ghostly green. The normal laws of the sky had been entirely rewritten by a mountain on the other side of the world. And when the sun began to set, the atmospheric horror reached its absolute zenith. The twilight skies across the globe erupted into violent, vivid apocalyptic shades of blood red and deep purple. The sunsets were so intensely, unnaturally vibrant that they looked exactly like massive, raging infernos. In several major American and European cities, the optical illusion was so terrifyingly perfect that fire departments were actually dispatched. They rushed their horse-drawn fire engines toward the horizon to extinguish a massive, city-consuming fire that simply did not exist. The entire planet was forced to witness the bleeding sky, a daily, haunting reminder of the catastrophe. This terrifying, bloody atmosphere deeply infected the human psyche, creeping into the very art and culture of the era. In Oslo, Norway, an artist named Edvard Munch was walking along a fjord at sunset. The sky suddenly turned a violent, screaming blood red. Munch felt a sudden, profound wave of existential dread, a feeling of an infinite scream passing through nature. He went back to his studio and painted that exact, terrifying blood-red sky, creating one of the most famous, haunting works of art in human history, The Scream, a masterpiece of psychological horror born directly from the volcanic ash of Krakatoa slowly drifting over Europe. The eruption of 1883 remains the ultimate, undeniable proof of our fragile insignificance. We meticulously build our ships, we chart our trade routes, and we sit on our wooden decks sipping wine, falsely believing that the Earth is a silent, conquered slave. We think our geography protects us, that a disaster on the other side of the globe is merely a headline in a newspaper. But Krakatoa proved that the physical universe is deeply, violently connected. A mountain collapsing in the Indian Ocean can block the sun in New York and paint the skies of Norway with blood. Nature's wrath does not recognize international borders, and it certainly does not care about colonial pride. When the Earth finally decides to speak, its voice is absolute. 36,000 souls were permanently silenced, washed into the deep, dark oceanic abyss, their lives traded for the birth of a new crater. Today, the remnants of Krakatoa still slumber in the Sunda Strait, slowly, patiently, rebuilding its strength beneath the dark water. A new, smaller volcano, Anak Krakatoa, the child of Krakatoa, now fiercely rises from the exact same violent caldera. It sits silently in the warm tropical waters, a dark, growing monument to the deadliest sound ever heard by mankind. It is a permanent, looming reminder that the beast is never truly dead. It is merely resting. History is not dead. It is never dead. It merely slumbers beneath the thick floating fields of gray pumice and the deep silent trenches of our forgotten past, patiently waiting to be remembered. We will meet again in the next era, when humanity once more forgets the terrifying silent warnings written in boiling water and blood-red skies. You are watching past Resurrected. Until the next era, silence, faint sound of deep, distant thunder echoing.